This happened near 20 years ago, late 90s, early 2000s. I was around 5 or 6. I'm a female and my family and I live in Australia. My suburb wasn't the worst, but it wasn't the best either. Back then it was mainly middle, lower income mixed with a lot of government housing, in which garners a pretty high crime rate in regards to drug dealing, breaking and entering, etc. But where we were, we never had any trouble and it was pretty safe street. Our old house had a huge steep driveway, which was incredible for riding your bike down, which is what I would do for an hour or two every weekend. My younger sister, who couldn't ride a bike, would just chill on the grass next to me watching. This older man would sometimes randomly walk past, around 6'5" and incredibly thin, yellow rotting teeth and a massive beard. He would walk past very slowly and wave, say hello, want to talk, would tell me how pretty I was, how pretty my bike was. I would always wave back, laugh, be polite and keep riding my bike up and down. He would do this for a good hour or two. I never thought anything of it. My dad worked nearby and would walk to and from work. At this point, this old man had been walking past every day, 3 or 4 times waving and smiling and chuckling. Like I said, my suburb was known for its characters, and even at a young age I was aware some people were quite special due to the drugs they did. So I just thought he was like that due to being under some influence. However, one afternoon after school I was riding my bike up and down, dropped the bike and went to walk from the top of my driveway inside. At the time, unbeknownst to the creepy man, my father was about 2 houses away coming home from work. The man started to walk, then sped up, then almost caught up to me with his arm up to grab me. I didn't notice until my dad was Usain Bolting it beside me and abusing this man. I walked inside and didn't really think much of it. Later on down the track, I found out this man was a paedophile. Literally. He had just been released from jail a few months prior, and a few of the residents caught wind and made flyers they'd handed out throughout the neighborhood to warn fellow parents, which is where my father had spotted him and recognized him. I never saw the man again. He just disappeared into thin air. The police got involved, but nothing really happened other than an attempted child abduction on the local news. My dad doesn't remember it all that well, but I always wonder if he hadn't been coming home from work that day, what would have happened to me. Before my parents had moved, we used to live in a house in Connecticut that had a forest behind it. We didn't live in a deserted area and was surrounded by a lively neighborhood. When I was around 5 years old, my parents would let me and my siblings go out and play with the neighborhood kids. Everyone knew one another and whose kid is who and which neighbor lived there, so it was safe for all the kids to go out and play on the street. One day when my parents had let me out, I had come home early bawling in tears and wouldn't stop mumbling. At first, my parents had thought one of the other kids had gotten me upset, so they didn't take it too seriously. My brother and sister, who were 7 and 8 at the time, didn't seem as upset at all. But the next day, my mother had ran into one of the neighborhood mothers in the grocery store, and according to the other mother, her twin sons had come home shaken up and in tears. They didn't speak much about it, but just mumbled exactly how I'd had done. When the mother finally got them to calm down, the twins didn't speak about it as if they had forgotten it had ever happened. By now, my mum was alarmed and wasn't entirely sure whether the neighborhood kids and me were being bullied, but nevertheless it had seemed like that. So she had told my dad, and they both decided to ring up each parent on the street to tell them about what was happening and to keep a close eye on all the children. A whole week had passed and not a single child came home crying. Mum had figured that the bullying had stopped, so she was at peace with herself for a small while. That is until I came home crying, screeching and clinging at my mum's legs, telling her to not let him take me away. My older brother and sister had also come home shaken up. Neither of them had told her what had happened. My mum tried getting me to elaborate on who he was, but each time I would end up in tears. Even my mum was shaken up that night, and my siblings and I refused to sleep alone, so we all tucked ourselves into my parents' bed. According to my mum, I kept tossing and turning. My sister slept so still. My mum thought she was frozen at first, and my brother kept mumbling abnormal things. All of this had spooked both my parents, considering we were usually quiet sleepers. To keep the incident from occurring again, my mum had banned us from going outside to play and had rung up every other mother to tell them about this. And to no surprise, each mother had experienced the same thing with their child. A whole 2 months passed. The once lively neighborhood had died down, and as it swept into autumn time, the street had become almost like a chilling ghost town. My mum tried to get us to speak about the incident, but as usual, we didn't recall it ever happening. As my sister's birthday had approached, she eagerly wanted us to go for a walk in the forest behind the house, like we used to before the incident had happened. My parents were cautious about it at first, but didn't see why not. After all, no other incidents had occurred for the past 2 months. So on my sister's birthday, we had all gotten ready for a small walk in the forest. There was a lake at the end that was great for skipping stones across. As we set off walking, my mum had this churning and nervous feeling as if something hadn't felt right when she entered the forest with my dad and us. She bypassed it as a normal anxiety and watched how my siblings and I barely looked afraid as we marched through the forest, singing and laughing. A whole 4 hours had passed and we finally got to the lake. Mum was setting up a small picnic with food she had brought. Dad had my brother and sister as they skipped rocks across the lake. My mum claimed I was acting very strange. She said I'd keep looking at a specific direction, and every time she had looked at me I was looking in that same direction or throwing glances towards it. She remembered how I had clung onto my jumper and looked almost bewildered. "What's wrong?" she had asked me as I crept close to her. "The man hanging from the tree is there again," I replied, barely in a whisper, as I pointed in the direction I was looking at. My mum took no notice of how I looked frightened, but not to the point where I was in tears yet. She had called my dad and siblings over, as her anxiety had finally overwhelmed her. My siblings had taken notice of the direction as well. To her it had suddenly fitted the picture, and she was ready to grab her family and run. It's probably an old kid's story. The older children must have made it up to scare the younger kids. My dad tried calming down my mum, who was by now spooked. My sister, Claudia, suddenly turned around to my parents, shaking her head. My sister was known in the family for having the ability to form sentences and was to chatter away. "That's not true, Daddy. The man said he has been here for a very long time. He said he didn't do anything wrong, and the people of the town have made him put a rope around his neck as a punishment." My parents were now shocked and totally speechless. "Mummy, he said he was going to do the same thing to everyone if we didn't listen to him," Claudia had continued. By now, my parents decided that it was time to head back home. The story goes that the neighborhood children were all playing a game of hide and seek in the forest. As every individual kid was found, there were only 2 left, the twins. When they had finally found the twins, they were both hysterically crying, pointing at a particular tree. As each kid had stared at the tree, they saw the same figure hanging from one of the large branches. The rope was tight around the figure's neck, and the details that I couldn't recall went on. But the children went by again, and he had become scarier. My parents contacted everybody, and my mum had done some research on the town. Not surprisingly, there were a lot of people being hung for crimes and accusations of being witches, and there was a man by the name of Edward Frinwick who was hung in the forest for being accused of robbery of a shopkeeper. Before that, he had been admitted into hospital numerous times on different occasions, to the point where the public believed he was mentally ill, and was indeed the robber. Not long after that, my dad's work had decided to relocate us, so we moved. The thing I find terrifying was that even when I had come back to the town with my family, and after the town had been dramatically altered, after 12 long years, I remembered exactly where that tree stood. The summer I moved to New York, I was out and about daily, racing from job interview to job interview. One of these days, a man stopped me on the street to ask for directions. Since I was new to the city, and this was pre-smartphones era, I simply told him I was new to the city and didn't know. I was overly excited that someone would think I would know my way around New York and started chatting to him, mentioning that I was on my way to a job interview. He then went on to tell me he's from LA and is in town because he's a producer for a new reality TV show. He then asked if I wanted to come with him to audition for it, since I had mentioned I was looking for a job. Being young and naive, his offer seemed intriguing and flattering to me, but I was already late for my interview. I asked him if he could email me and I could audition another time. I started telling him my email address and I could tell he was pretending to type it into his phone, and he wasn't actually putting it in. I brushed it off, figuring that maybe he was just in a rush. I ended up saying goodbye and went right on to my interview, not giving the strange man I met another thought. Fast forward 3 years later. I'm in a different part of town in New York City, close to where I was living at the time, when a guy on the street stops me for directions. He asked me about a specific restaurant that I had never heard of before and told him as much. He then started telling me he's from LA, he's in town to film a reality show, and would I like to come to audition? And that's when I froze. My stomach flipped and every hair on the back of my neck stood up. It was the same man from 3 years earlier. I literally stopped walking, turned and faced him and said, "I've met you before." He acted kind of awkward and said, "Oh, you have?" I said, "Yeah," in an FU kind of way to let him know I was onto him. He mumbled something else and quickly walked away. I just stood there on the street completely shocked and creeped out by what had happened. I guess I'll never really know what the reality show producer had in store for me. This happened about 10 or so years ago, when I was in my early teens, about 14. I am a female. I come from a very large but close-knit Dutch family, the kind where you even know your second and third cousins pretty well, and we'd all do a big family camping trip every year at this lake. One of my many cousins, we'll call her Charlotte, was about 18 or 19 and had recently eloped with this older guy, Paul, that none of us knew. He was at least in his 30s, if not older. She'd successfully pissed off the patriarchs of the family. My great-grandparents had come damn close to disowning her for such a stupid stunt, but we were all trying to make the best of it and kind of get to know the guy, as it would appear he was now one of the clan. I was part of a gaggle of about 20 cousins, and we all hung out together in little clusters pretty much 24/7. We spent most of our days on the dock, taking turns going tubing or using the new wave runners our grandfather had bought us. Paul was out there too, a lot. At first he didn't seem too strange, even if he was a bit old for Charlotte. My own parents have a wide age gap, so I was open-minded about it all. But he still gave me the subtle creeps. Before long, I noticed a swastika tattooed along with some other racial stuff on his shaved head. That was a little disturbing. And he really just got creepier from there. He was way too handsy with Charlotte's younger sister. He kept trying to chuck her in the lake from the dock, and something about the way he manhandled her made all of us cousins a little uncomfortable. A year passed. Charlotte and Paul had a kid. They named the baby something with the word Aryan in it, like as in the Aryan Brotherhood, which made me think back to the tattoo. He was at the family camping trip again the next summer, also still uncomfortably handsy. My cousins and I always stuck close to each other, as he was radiating a whole new level of off this year. I remember waiting on the dock for a wave runner to become available so I could take a ride. Paul eagerly offered to give me a ride. I remember looking him up and down and getting a funny feeling in the pit of my stomach. Something wasn't right. The guy had hardly spoken directly to me ever, and suddenly he was super friendly. No thanks, I said. I'll wait for my dad. Turned out to be one of the best decisions of my life. The following April I heard that Paul had been arrested. My mum wouldn't tell me why. She said it would be too confusing and disturbing for me. But she asked a lot of questions about my interactions I'd had with Paul. I told her I didn't like him much, and us cousins always stayed together, so I'd never be alone with him. Her relief was very obvious, and not another word was said. I was a good kid and ignored my curiosity for a while, but Googled him about a year later and nearly threw up when I read what he'd been arrested for. He was a level 2 sex offender, convicted of drugging, raping, and exploiting several girls my age at the time, and a lot more stuff I won't mention here. Much of it occurring while he was married to my cousin. We haven't spoken much about Paul since, but my cousin divorced him, and he is obviously not allowed to see his child. Charlotte's moved on and has a great husband and more kids now, and seems happy and well adjusted. Paul's tried to contact her, but she can't even see him across a room without having a full-blown panic attack. He was only in jail for 5 years, which seems way too short to me. I can't help but be insanely grateful for my intuition about him kicking in, but I always feel like we'll never fully be rid of Paul. I decided to stop at the park near my house to let my niece have some playtime. Sitting on one of the nearby benches, I heard someone put their stuff on a table behind me, which surprised me because I did not hear a vehicle or anyone walking up. I turned around to see who was behind me. It was a short, overweight, unfit, middle-aged man with long hair, putting his motorcycle helmet on the table. I figured he was there to use one of the picnic tables. I started to wonder where he came from since I had not seen his motorcycle, so I turned around to figure out where he had parked. That is when I noticed he had removed his coat and was walking towards the playground. He walked over to the ladder bars and stood there. Is he really going to play on the child's playground? Why is he just standing there? Is he staring at my 2-year-old niece? I realized at that point he was between me and my niece, and I was feeling very uncomfortable. She was as well, apparently, because she ran over to me and sat down. After watching him and his antics with a pull-up or two, a dip there, and him moving in between each one, my niece was ready for her turn. I followed her around, but she did not seem to want to do anything while he was there. He left very shortly after he arrived. The weird thing is, there is another park, a short distance, no more than a minute away by motorcycle, that does have workout equipment for adults.